Jordan, our historian, but I had to give that up and do it this summer here for her. But anyway, so a little bit of what this is about is the heritage of our islands. We like to think about it in terms of boat castle, things like that, right? But there's one that's kind of deeper than that, you could say, right? And I like to call it kind of a hidden heritage, right? Because it's not anything you could really see. We can even see right now, if you really want to go clamp around in the brush, you could see something like ruins of a fort, like Fort Carlton. You could go to Canada and see Frontenac. You can see some of the early historic things. They're above ground, right? But much of what I'm going to talk about isn't anything you can see, right? So that's where archaeologists come in, I guess. But so I want to see if we could kind of connect you all a little bit more to that, because just from my experience, you know, we can do DNA testing, right? Well, I had my DNA tested and I was so excited, and when I got it, I was totally bummed out because I have absolutely no native blood in me at all. Zero, nada. So that was a crushing blow. But I realized that it's not just that connects you, right? We all have connections. If you care about this place, you're, in a sense, if you care about that piece of water, you're connected in this sense, okay? So I'm trying to build on that and kind of connect you to actually what the history was of the people that were here before us, so to speak. And essentially this heritage is older than the Thousand Islands, right? Because the Thousand Islands, what you see today, is only actually about 7,000 years old. If you've gone back farther in time, it changes. It changes drastically, actually. If you would come back here 10,000 years ago, the river would have been flowing backwards and a lot shallower where we are now. And there would have been a waterfall near Cape Vincent going into Lake Ontario. To get to Lake Ontario, you would have come from Tibbetts Point and had to walk miles to get to it. The lakes dropped. So our landscape's changed a lot, and it really has only gotten to what we would recognize today in the last 7,000 years or so. So it's phenomenal. But the thing to remember is all the time there's people living here, adapting to the landscape, right? And changing with the landscape. Whatever they did, of course you had to change with the landscape. When the water changes, you change. So if we think about it, 13,000 years ago is actually the earliest evidence in our region of people, because that we can point to. Essentially, if you all know the Tug Hill, right, and how high that sits up above us, right, we're sitting right now about between, maybe 260 feet sea level, give or take, right? Tug Hill, there's a paleo shoreline on the Tug Hill at about 600 feet sea level, which is actually the shoreline of a glacial lake, right? This is the lake that was formed after it all melted off up here. So that is pretty impressive. 13,000 years ago, we'd have been underwater, about 300 feet. Hold your breath, right? So, yeah. So the thing of it is that it only took within a 200-year span for that to drain down. Now, 13,000 years ago, it's been identified people on the shoreline of this paleo shoreline were actually building boats. They were building canoes, right? Now imagine that on a frozen lake looking like Alaska with icebergs in the distance on this giant lake, and possibly being able to see this glacial formation still melting. It's just phenomenal, right? And there's people on the shoreline that we've identified, not me personally, but my colleagues have identified, actually building boats on that shoreline. So just like you would imagine Alaskans or people in the far north would be. And so this slide here is just kind of showing you a little bit of a range, right? So 13,000 years ago, the tool assemblage was something that to make these boats, I wouldn't even have recognized until I read the paper and looked at all this stuff. It's a whole subject. But the points, the projectile points people were using were these fluted points that you may have heard of, that are probably the most recognizable thing from the very early people, was a fluted point, which you'll see up at the top. Now, when I was speaking about 10,000 years ago when the lake was down and the river was kind of flowing backwards, that was a period called the Lake Low Stand. And our area still maintained water, okay, because all of the meltwater that used to go into Lake Ontario through Lake Erie actually was coming down the Trent River across the way from us, still feeding our little basin here. Waterfall going down Cape Vincent. At that period of time, the spear point on your left is, or I guess that's your left, yeah, is specifically designed for caribou hunting. So what this demonstrates is that at that point in time, actually, when the lake drops down, becomes very dry, all of that exposed lake becomes grassland. We have a caribou migration that comes through here, all right, just like you see on Alaska. I mean, literally, big caribou migration, and then it crossed the river basin, our river, somewhere just up, like basically by Clayton here, and went across the foot of Grindstone and between Wellesley Island. Eel Bay, if you're familiar with the area, was a grassland. They hung out there, and then they made their way to Canada. That spear point actually came from an island over by Canada that we actually visited on our boat tour at Gordon's Island. It's demonstrating that not only was there a caribou migration, but these people were basically on the islands at that same time, which means they needed canoes, right? So that still shows that even though they may have adapted to this or kind of mingled with these people making these spears and the caribou hunters, there were still this marine people hanging out, building boats, doing their thing, right? So the next two pieces, you got a smaller point there that kind of shows a typical point from the next period of time when you would go to from paleo people with big spears, caribou, megafauna, to a period where they're, you call it the hunter-gatherer period, right? It's the best way you can think of it. So, and then that piece of pottery is from woodland, which is basically, think of that as when you first see pottery and start growing things, crops, right? So, let's see. And in our region, it's not just like this ancient kind of coastal homeland where people have kind of been continually living, because basically we can demonstrate where essentially, other than when this lake drains, especially lake drained down to like 200 years, down to about 300 feet sea level, a little higher than where we are. So we've had some stages, but all during that time we can kind of show people have been here and doing the marine thing. In other words, when I say marine, I mean freshwater marine, because there's always fish available, et cetera, right? So across the world, that's where people congregate, is along coastlines. It's no different here, right? The resources are focused there. Even if your landscape goes through drastic changes, you're still going to have this focused marine, freshwater marine resourcing, right? And so one of the other things that's really interesting about our region, right, is that it basically different than a lot of places, because number one, we got all these marine resources that are continually here for the last 13,000 years, right? But on top of that, it's a trade route connection. So many places in the Northeast and actually across the Americas, you have major pathways that Native American use, right? And a pathway is not just a road. A pathway in archaeological terms means a place where people utilized as a road, but they also lived along it, essentially, right? And that pathway can be water or land, or a combination. So across the world you have these, and many times they'll cross or intersect or this kind of thing, and you'll have a couple come together, maybe three. But our region's a little bit different, and it's all about the geography, and and we have a lake and a river, that kind of thing. So when you look at it that terms, here's a schematic, right? Just some lines, but it's showing you roughly what happens when you start mapping out the rough pathways in our region, in New York State. Okay, let me see if I can get my little pointer going here. No, doesn't show up. Oh, I'm supposed to get a little red dot show up, but it doesn't work. But anyway, you can see On the right side, there's one up and down red line. That's like the Hudson Valley Champlain Valley route that connects you northward. You have a route that follows the Mohawk Valley. You have one that kind of swoops down to the Susquehanna, and so on and so forth. You can see these are just the general outlines, right? And you can see where several of them will intersect. Then you come up here where we are, and there's like 6 of them.
Right there.
In order to reach these other pathways, you have to deal with this big chunk of water, right? So it's kind of a function of geography in a sense, but also if you're familiar with the river, all you go down past Chippewa Bay or anything, the river starts becoming very cliffs on either side and everything, so it kind of becomes not so good for travel. So all of these big long pathways intersect here, and we know that by the stuff we've basically recovered over the years, archaeologists. So, which is pretty fascinating because we've recovered stuff from as far away as the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, right? Copper Spear Point. We've recovered stuff from all over in Pennsylvania. The materials come from Ohio Valley, Hope Willian, if you've heard of that term. Artifacts have been found here, which come from deep in the valley, but Ohio. And also recently a spear point that was made from chert flint that came from Newfoundland. So that's even a new one for me. So we have all kinds of stuff intersecting here. And that has really driven a lot of what's gone on around here. So as an archaeologist, knowing that, it kind of changes the dynamic and how you interpret everything, right? Because it's very much different than if you were a nation growing up or developing down here in the Finger Lakes or anyplace else. So eventually, these people the last people that I should say that were here were the Iroquois people. So all of these people that are in this whole region are all speaking an Iroquois language at some point. Don't know the interplay exactly, but that's interesting to think that all of the way around Lake Ontario and the St. Lawrence Valley, when Europeans show up, all of those people were speaking the Iroquois language. Every place else in this region, when we say the Northeast, was Algonquin, right? That's a linguistic perspective. You would say that the Iroquois speakers were an island in the Algonquin Sea. That's how linguistically you look at it. So, which is true, but why is debated, right? So, but anyway, so that's one of the major aspects of our region, and then along with that, something else kind of occurs is that because excuse me a second, because there's so much stuff going on up here, this interaction and everything, we get all these influences. But one of the influences from a bunch of different places, because you see different places, is basically comes down to building stone landscapes. All right. So when we were all growing up, we were taught that the natives up here didn't even know how to pick a rock up other than to make a hearth, right? They didn't know what to do, which is mind-boggling. Okay, but in fact, they constructed a lot of things out of stone. And a lot of them are in our region. It's kind of concentrated, right? There's certain parts of the world, certain parts of New York State, other places where these things are concentrated. And this is a big one here. Probably the most well-known would be the Perch Lake Mounds, which are just over here in Perch River, Perch Lake, which look like giant rubble stone donuts that are about 30 feet across, and they're only about a few feet high. There was some other ones that were larger, but I've seen quite a few of them, and they're really strange, right? And there's been a lot of testing. A colleague of mine did a huge amount of botanical analysis of the material they found in there, right? So what were they doing with these things, right? Because they found bits and pieces of pottery, this and that, but nothing consistent time-wise. So they got them dated. Don't ask me the date. It's like 1,500 years ago or 2,000, something like that. But they could not find a consistent botanical reason. Like they weren't processing food. That's what everybody thought. These people were processing something, and these stone donuts are full of burnt stuff. No, nothing in there. It's just charcoal. So there's so basically what they're classified as is ceremonial. For some reason they were building stone donuts, building a big fire in it, and looks like they might have smothered that fire out after a while. Unclear. You know, it's really strange. But there's like a bunch of them in one area over in Perch Lake. Now, on the right side, it's kind of hard to make out, but that is a stone mound that pictures something like a stone igloo that doesn't really have an entrance, but it's a stone igloo shaped like a hemisphere that is about 40 feet across, and it's about 7 feet high, 6 or 7 feet high. In the middle of it, you might be able to tell, my little pointer isn't working, so I'm gonna point with my finger. There's a depression. Now, what that depression is essentially there's a stone box built into this. And we believe it was utilized as an ossuary, right? Something to that effect. And that's over on a place on Point Peninsula where there's a whole bunch of stone kind of constructions, including a stone platform mound, right? You've heard of, in Ohio, the platform mounds, right? Well, actually, we have one that's about the size of a football field and elevates about 15 feet off the surrounding terrain. So these people are very busy builders, right? So that was basically constructed out of stone and rubble. And a lot of that was around ceremonial uses. There's actually a ceremonial walkway leading up to this thing on top of this platform. Multiple individuals were interred in there. I know that because they were disturbed, unfortunately. But it's kind of a strange place. There's probably at least half a dozen stone monuments on this same chunk of ground. There's several mounds that are like that, but they're connected by lines of boulders. They're like a snaking line of large boulders. It's like really crazy. So crazy that nobody really recognized what it was, okay? Archaeologists, there's been some out there, but it's not anything expected up here because we were taught from, maybe not your younger folks, but these people up here didn't build these. They didn't make things like this. But that, in fact, is like totally wrong. So over the last few years, we identified a bunch of these stone constructions. There's one on you would call it the uplands of French Creek, back in a little ways on sort of this limestone landscape that's actually a large, it's probably, we gotta transfer meters into feet, probably 10 feet to 12 feet wide at the base and about 6 feet high. And it's, in profile, it's like if you cut a cross section, it'd be like a U shape, okay? This is something that kind of winds, it's relatively serpent shaped. It's well over a couple hundred feet long. Leads down into a spring that's been lined with stones. It's crazy. But again, a lot of these things are in places where people didn't care about agriculturally, and most people, it wasn't recognized because you just didn't think they were here. Until somebody said, hey, what is that, right? So, and the one on the left is actually on property I own. That's kind of a boulder. You would first gets classified as a boulder arrangement, because clearly when you look at that, something's going on, right? I mean, that's not Mother Nature there. And in fact, you can't see it, but behind that is a low U-shaped mound that goes out that's been constructed. A few years ago, I cleaned out around it, and those boulders are sitting on smaller limestone pieces, and this is all dirt, or this dirt is maybe 6 inches deep at the most. It's all flat limestone like we have around here. Those boulders are actually sitting on little limestone slabs that they've been levered to basically sit in that configuration, which is pretty astounding. So somebody maneuvered those around. There's some other rocks you don't see in these things that are actually stretched out on a east-west axis from this. This points at And a lot of things around here relate to astronomical or solar events. And this one basically, this functions like another site around here as a calendar in a sense also, because when you look through this notch, line it up with a couple other boulders, it points at the rising of Sirius on the equinox, which to the Native Americans is the dog star, right? So on the equinox, if you want to go out there, if it's nice weather, you'll watch it rise vertically, right? In other words, if you ever seen Sirius chasing the hunter, right? That kind of what's that? Gosh, it's eluding. What's the name of that star configuration? Oh gosh, well, the Pleiades. The hunter chases the Pleiades, and it's all just a big thing. But anyway, Sirius, the brightest star of the sky, rises up vertically with the hunter, the other three stars, and it's I've seen it once up there, but anyway, it lines up with that. And this is an important point for them. It's that date, right? Because I mean, if you think about it, they didn't have a calendar that you would just pop up, hey man, it's time to plant our corn, right? They need to know when certain specific times and points in the year are. So equinoxes is important, right? So, and there's basically it aims at other things. So we basically figured out a lot of these stone constructions are essentially all about calendars. There's a site on Fort Drum, when I first, I don't know how many long ago, it was my colleague Dr. Rush took me out on Fort Drum to a site called the Calendar Site. Explained, oh yeah, it's neat, it shows calendars, shows the sunrises on this day, on solstice, etc. Took me out there, and I'm looking around expecting to see some kind of, I don't know what, but something that would oh yeah, it's a and just basically there's some boulders clustered together. But what you didn't realize, I was like, that was anticlimactic. But when they excavated around it, they saw post molds, because it's nice sand out there, where somebody stuck a post in, and it lined right up with a gap between the boulders, and when you aimed right at the sunrise and the solstice, or actually some astronomical events, moon phases, things like that. I was kind of blown away. I'm like, wow, okay. But then, so that's kind of an example of that type of thing. So we have a ton of those around here. The mound on the right, there was in 1880 something. There was recorded right across the river along the Bay of Quinte. There was recorded over 100 of those. And we have multiples here. Some of these aren't identified simply because, well, I'll put it this way. If you've ever looked at a farm field and wondered, nice deep soil, beautiful soil, here's a farm field, but you ever wondered why there's a big giant stone pile in the middle of it? Because I know farmers pretty well. I've been growing up here. You wouldn't pile your rocks in the middle of your field when you're clearing your field of rocks. Right? I mean, so archaeologically what that means is that most likely some of those big piles were actually there when the farmers were clearing their fields of rocks, and they said, that's too big, that's too much work, I'm just going to use it. We do have some examples of that here. So we know that those kinds of, I don't know how many there are. There's probably a lot of them. But so I want to get into a little bit about the Woodland Age, right, which is people are most familiar with. So this is the Haudenosaunee, right? Iroquois, 5 nations. That's what they called themselves, was the Haudenosaunee. Okay, now if you went across the river, it was a little different. There's a Huron, but here was the Haudenosaunee. So this was the, basically the heritage you can all closest to, because these nations still exist, right? Up here, it's a little different because the populations that were here sort of dispersed when the Europeans showed up. I wonder why. They basically went to the 5 nations, and they went to the Huron or Wyandot people across the river. So in other words, the Iroquois people to go back to that original thing where they were all the same speakers, they basically, the ones that lived here in the St. Lawrence Valley where we are now, they kind of went a couple directions because they're all related. Okay, so, and this, again, is something that can be touched now because, again, you have all the 5 nations, you have these people that are still here. That's, I guess, the point I want to make, is that, so that the people didn't disappear, which is an archaeological debate, that the people right here disappeared, right? Which is nonsense. Some of us are in the process of proving that wrong, and I'll speak a little bit about that. But anyway, I just want to show you this is the ceramics. All right, this is right around here, and this shows you more or less the progression, because earlier ceramics would look different than the later ceramics, right? Years ago, they thought that early ceramic stuff was Algonquin and the Iroquois must come in and kick them out, but actually in reality that didn't happen. It was kind of nonsense. So over here is the earliest type of ceramics we have. This is the outside, this is the inside, okay? So this is called Point Peninsula pottery, all right? And it's always a dead giveaway. This is the inside. For some reason they were wiping it like this, okay? We're not really sure, all right? And then you can see as time goes, these are a little bit later in that kind of, you could see a progression. Starts building up, you end up with these ellipse, right? Which build into something a little more elaborate. And then you end up with the final bit, which is our classic Iroquois pottery around here, is with this big overhanging rim, okay? So this is kind of just a snapshot of the transition of the ceramics around here. So that's why, and of course with the modern dating and everything else like that, that's why we can look at something and say, okay, this is, and it's funny because on Canada they use different lingo, right? Over here I would call this Point Peninsula pottery. In Canada you would call it ancestral Iroquois. Both are right, okay? The Point Peninsula is just a name coined by an archaeologist for an era. Okay, so in Canada, all of this is ancestral Iroquoian, just different phases. We're kind of the same way, we just give it names after sites, that's all. So if you really want me to be technical, Point Peninsula, and this would be called Pillar Point, both of which are named right around here. So, but anyway, so that's kind of a sample of what the Iroquois pottery looks like, and they're kind of the red rock is up there is actually a chunk of petrified, so to speak, paint. When it was left in the ground, it was clay, like consistency, and you could still, you can't see it here, but in that sample you could still see a person's handprint embedded in it. And yeah, you touch it, you're red. But that's something we plan on getting analyzed to see exactly what they were making in that, or putting in that to make paint, because believe it or not, I think we believe we found a site that they were mining, so to speak, and gathering minerals for making paint on our own property, actually, nearby. So, who knows? So anyway,
excuse me, Ken, do you
yes,
know what the time period is from the left to right?
Let me go back to, so woodland period basically starts about 3,000 years ago, all right? And they first really pottery starts showing up in this, maybe 2,500 years ago, 3,000 years ago. Very first, like, ooh, that's actually pottery, okay? So this here is probably ranges from 2,000 to, maybe, right? And then 1,000. And then it kind of works up into this is like 500 years ago. So you're looking at it roughly 2,000, 2,500 years ago to 500 years ago. Across that, okay? You parse it out a little bit differently for each, but that's generally what you're looking at. About 2,500 years worth of pottery. The last one being maybe 500 years ago. give you, is that?
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, cool. So the other thing about the Iroquois society is they had a huge amount of bone tools, right? Very available substance, right? But something they used constantly, because if you think about it, we use hardware stores and stuff, right? All that kind of jazz. Whatever we need, we go get it. Not the same, right? So a lot of these are tools, like these are broken, of course, but they're used to enlarging holes, making holes, if you're sewing leather or bark, right? Also, some of these, if you think they're, of course, some of these are broken, the bases off them, but if you think about it, you have to make nets, you have to weave, right? So think of these in terms of those. Some of these are used for scraping. Of course, you can see up here, this is a barbed point, part of a barbed point, which is fishing, because these people, unlike our Iroquois folks up here, which archaeologists call St. Lawrence Iroquois, for lack of a better term, their diet was much more fish than if you say you went down to the Onondaga or the Oneida, right? You would see a much higher corn diet down there, so to speak, but you come up here and they had abundance, okay? That's always something to bear in mind with these people up here. They're always, even in the Iroquois times, they're still focused on this marine activity, because we find their stuff in the same places as the places where we found stuff that's 10,000 years old. So when you find that whole range of the same people going to the same place, you know they're doing the same activity. So, and some of the things, you know, decorative wise, of course, they loved all kinds of stuff. But here you have starting with a fox, wolf, and then into these bear teeth, which on certain sides they'd flatten them out and hang them up, be cool necklace, fashionable. Got some antlers here, tine, that were used for a variety of things. Sometimes they're just basically used to flake points, right? But the interesting thing about, and before I go on, these are actually, you can't tell because they're hollow in this end. If you tied a string to a little ball and you went, bloop, tried to catch it in a little cup and ball, that's actually what those are. Sometimes they use those for decorations. They make a necklace of them around there, but actually a lot of them, there's not an image of one, but they're hollowed out in the end, right? And it's like in a little cone, almost a cone shape, and it's a cup and ball.
A toy, essentially.
A toy, yeah, absolutely. Well, they had kids too, But we find weird things like a bear claw. These are beaver teeth. All right, beaver teeth are extremely hard. They chew trees. If you're a woodworker, if your life depends on a canoe, right, and you've got to work wood and bark almost daily, essentially, these are essential. You find these all over Iroquois sites around here, because up here, you lived by your canoe. You really did. So, and the interesting thing too about our region is once you get into this Iroquois period, or the last, say, Iroquois period ends here roughly 500 years ago, but for that 500 or 600 years that we go the classic Iroquois period, up here they stopped using stone points. Right, you go to the Onondaga or the Oneida or someplace, you're working on a site there, and there's all these little stone points called Madison points. They're little triangles. It's the classic Iroquois point. We didn't have them. One of the reasons may be because we don't have good flint to make the stuff out of, right? Which is always an issue. You gotta have the right material, right? But these people also had a huge resource in terms of the amount of whitetail that were up here and other bone-bearing things, right? So to back up a second, if you think about most of the Northeast at the time, it's a basically primeval forest, right? The classic thing we think about, giant trees. Around here, historical sources you can find, all the trees, you couldn't, two of us couldn't put our arms around, right? So we have a forest like this. Well, where we are right here, we have a lot of this, what you would call, for lack of a better term, limestone terrain, right? I think if anybody lives around here, you know what I'm talking about. It's where there's no dirt. All right, it's all limestone, it's flat, no dirt. We have a preserve over here called the Chameau Barrens. That's a kind of a preserved area to show you what. So the thing of it is in this time, you would have a forest, but up here we had these little patches of prairie because that's what grew in these shallow soil areas. It's all grasses and stuff like that. We had concentrations of whitetails that you wouldn't find anyplace else. Just living here, didn't have to do anything, right? Most areas, you want to make a cornfield and down by, you know, the Oneidas, you'd have to clear a forest, right? Cut the trees down, you had to do all that stuff. Up here, you know, you had these naturally open spaces, which is pretty cool. So, and up here, the other thing with corn, if you think about, okay, I gotta grow some corn, I got a rock, and I got a stick. Well, how and what are you gonna do? Where are you gonna go? Well, you're gonna focus in, at least I would, on soils that are basically sand base, loamy, sandy soils, because that's about the easiest thing to work. And that is where we find all these Iroquois sites associated with an area that's like that, right? We have at least 2 sites on headwaters of French Creek. French Creek, you may not realize, is all sand and gravel down through there. A lot of muck now, but it's all sand and gravel. Prime soil, keep a village going. So, but these, going back to these, pardon me if I ramble. So they had a huge source of whitetail, right, because of those areas, open areas. Whitetail congregate, especially in the winter. So what you see up here are the antler tines. Down here, these are bird bone or some other type of a critter. They made their points for their arrows out of bone. Now, this is probably the most perfect shape you'll see in terms of the antler tine type. See, it's pointed. It's got this curved notch, and it's hollow. And that just affixed to the end of your arrow shaft. Now the thing about a bone point, if I shot it and it hit something hard, it would basically bounce. If I took my stone point and shot it at something hard, it'd shatter. And I'd have to sharpen it or use it now for a scraper, and you go, God damn, you know. So actually, that's a big point. Plus, aerodynamically, might be better. Don't know. There's a big debate over why these guys up here strictly use these. And this kind of shows you one in process. See how they're kind of shaping it, working on hollowing it out to get this end shape. So these are basically all these points, either they're essentially broken or in process, right? And then these are the same type. These are just made from an actual bone. They have a little different hafting technique for them. You can see at the end, but yeah, so these guys did not use the same stone points that all of the other Iroquois speakers were using. Why? Some of the most educated folks have determined that it was because it was a trade embargo. They couldn't get the material to make it. Now, it could very well be. I do not know. But I also think that there's some pretty good advantages to these points, especially you have like a ton of that, right? I mean, we know across the river that Iroquois were making basically brush fences that turn into a V called a deer pound and pushing big herds of deer. And basically they didn't have to use a bow and arrow, they just were at the other end with a spear, right? But you end up anyway, if you're feeding a large village, you end up with a lot of horn, a lot of bone. There's some great reuse, right? They weren't going to toss it, so there may be a good reason why physically they were using these points, but also this may relate to something culturally, right? There may be, it may be representing a cultural phenomenon that these people were just like, maybe it was part of their thing, you know, we don't use stone, we only use the bone points or whatever. I don't know. It's an open subject. It's pretty open subject, you could say. most of the academics are pretty convinced it was a trade embargo, but I'm not. You know, it's just me.
So terrorists weren't involved at that point?
I don't know. It may be. So, we don't really know. I should say that we've had 5 or 6 villages occupied up here, Iroquois villages. If you came here 500-600 years ago, you'd have found 5 to 6 villages occupied in the Jefferson County zone, right? Which, in terms of geography, is phenomenal compared to any other place in Iroquois, right? You go to the Onondaga, the Oneida, you'll find a village, then you go, you know, I don't know how many miles before you hit another one, right? Big space with spaced out village sites. Sometimes they clustered a couple together, but generally not. And up here, there's one spot up here where I can drive down the road, and in the 4 miles, I hit 4 different sites, go by them. 4 different village sites, which is unheard of anyplace else. It's like, wow, because it's always thought, well, they do their village, their soil's trashed after 20 years because, you know, they just slashed and burned to grow their corn. And they have to move on because they used up all the firewood. But I always point out, what was the first thing that got taught to those poor folk there that showed up on the shore, you know, Mayflower thing, where they kind of said, hey, bury a fish underneath your corn, it'll grow really good. Something we were taught as kids. I'm not sure why that gets lost now in the modern archaeologists. These people are organic farmers. They knew what they were doing. They ate a lot of fish. You know what they did with that fish? They fertilized their fields. They didn't have to move their fields because they burned them up and they couldn't sustain themselves. And actually some recent science testing in the soil is actually bearing that out, which is pretty neat. So, but we had a lot of people plugged into a small space geographically. It was sustainable because we had excellent sandy soils in areas, but we had the unending freshwater marine resources, right? Because what we don't see now is a big deal. What we don't see now is the original landlocked salmon runs, right? That were here before Europeans. Every single stream, every place along Lake Ontario and the Thousand Islands got stuffed full of salmon. You could pull up historical accounts about taking pitchforks, the farmers, early first settlers. We have to go down with a pitchfork and pitchfork the salmon up to, on a wagon to fertilize their fields. I kid you not. These salmon didn't die, mind you, like salmon in Alaska, they all spawn and die. These guys went back out to the lake. They actually developed during that lake low stand period where they couldn't get out and go to the ocean. So, but I mean, that's just one fish, right, that could sustain you. Also in November and December, when everything else is getting dicey around here, right, that's when the lake herring, which we almost killed off, they're coming back, the Cisco, spawned, all right, fish get big or whatever, but they could be a couple pounds, I think, maybe up to 5. They spawned in shallow waters at that time of the year, and their prime spawning area was Chameau Bay, where there's these big, long, shallow limestone shelves. That's where they wanted to spawn. That's where they laid their eggs, right? So what do we find over there? Tons of these net sinkers. They're picking up pebbles and making net sinkers out of them and netting these things. So, you know, you go from salmon fishing to netting massive amounts of these fish. They had the resources. So it's pretty interesting that, you know, that these guys, I think, when we had a population explosion, so to speak, on the record archaeologically up here, the Iroquois population grew more than it should have, in a sense, technically. Now, I don't know if I agree with that, but in other words, when you say, well, you know, mama had so many babies, et cetera, you build it out, there's not enough to account for the people that were here. So I think that some people came here, but at the same time, and I've been working with another guy, we think that there may have been drought conditions along the southern tier where it made stressing, like the Haudenosaunee villages down there, etc. Up here, if your cornfield's within X amount of feet of a big pile of water, you're never going to be going dry. As long as you got little Indian kids, you know, just like the Amish today, carrying buckets of water to the fields. So in other words, Native Americans up here had the ability to keep their cornfields just cooking, even in a drought. So we were thinking that the population explosion they experienced with people coming from the other nations, we call it nations, they would call it my clan cousin living in, you know, wherever, come on up. And that's what we think a lot of this rise of extra population we see here. Because yeah, no other place do you see 5 or 6 villages in this tight of an area, because there's not the natural environment to sustain that much. Now, another thing to think about also is the Thousand Islands is a corridor. It's a wildlife corridor, okay? If you look at the Adirondacks and you go over to Canada and you look, there's the Algonquin Highlands. They kind of mimic each other. They're all the same geology, and they're connected through the Thousand Islands. And what's been more recently discovered in the last century is that this is a bottleneck, in a sense, the Thousand Islands, for this wildlife, but it becomes, Canada is recognized as the key wildlife corridor in the Northeast, right? It's called the Adirondacks to Algonquins corridor. And they discovered this by radio tagging a moose in the Adirondacks, and it ended up in the Algonquins Highlands. It swam across the river right out here. Now, that's pretty startling. So they figured out that this is a huge thing, okay? It also plays into these folks right here. They knew about it. Why did I can tell you that? I can tell you that specifically because within this corridor area, right, you see all kinds of sites up until a certain point in time when you had a big population. So when you hit the Iroquois time, suddenly the Iroquois villages are on either side, so to speak, of this corridor, or on the fringes. They didn't want to. You wouldn't build your wouldn't build your village in the middle of where you're hunt, right? So they recognized it, which is, you know, pretty fascinating. But it just builds on this idea that they had this huge amount of resources available that other areas didn't necessarily have, which may have put them in a little danger. May have been a little bit of envy going on around them. I don't know, because we still don't know exactly why these folks left. The timelines when first Europeans come here in 1532 or whatever, Cartier downriver, where that hits and where these people disappear, they say disappear, they're kind of very close. It's very, very murky, right? So we don't have all the sites around here dated. The latest dating we have is around 1520s. Believe everybody kind of agrees, even the skeptics, that it probably gets up to the 1550s. I probably would push it, might be a little bit farther than that, just based on some evidence I've seen. So you start seeing a pretty close lineup between when Champlain is supposedly the first cat that comes through here, right? First guy comes through in 1616, I believe it is. He's gone his way to the Onondagas to go start a war. The European, it's something they did, you know, start a war. So, but it becomes very close. So we don't really know what the heck goes on. Why we have 5 or 6 thriving villages in say 1520, and then by 1616 Champlain comes through and he doesn't see anybody. But Cartier, those original visits could have actually, for one thing, set off a disease vector, right? Work its way down. Hey, check this blanket out. This dude that's all white came in this giant canoe with a sail. Check it out. Pass it around. Suddenly you've got, you know, half these populations are nailed with smallpox, right? Or some other European disease. So that's one possibility. There's also possibility of warfare. Now, some colleagues have done some research. It's called social network analysis. Big bunch of words. And what they did is basically take a bunch of, they look at the pottery and they go, okay, it's got a bunch of these lines going this way, it's got 4 lines going sideways. They pick a bunch of what they call attributes, right? and they compare them to other places in the Iroquoian world, right, and see if they're the same, right? And if they're the same, right, it demonstrates that, okay, they've communicated. There must be some interaction because they're doing the same thing here and over there. And they make a graph out of it that looks like a bunch of lines connecting dots. It looks like spaghetti. But you do, what it comes down to is it shows a role in this region of these Iroquois in the greater Iroquois story, right? Between the Hurons and the Five Nations, which eventually go to war, and it's just nasty. You know, Europeans get involved; it's a big mess. Prior to that, just before European contact, right? The social network analysis shows, okay, wait a minute, one particular group in our little area is acting as what they call a broker, a middleman. They are kind of doing the peace thing between the Five Nations and the Hurons, right? Somehow they're brokering peace between them, keeping things on the level, everything's good, right? Now the social network analysis shows that when you remove this one group of people, suddenly all heck breaks out and it looks exactly like what history shows us. So in other words, they've been able to demonstrate a couple ways that actually this one group is really something. Well, the interesting is that's the group of villages in Clayton here, called the Clayton cluster. When they remove that, all of a sudden all heck breaks loose. All right, so that's kind of crazy because it actually mimics some of the archaeology that we've found. And let's see, I'm just checking the time so I don't go too far. And also to tie in some of the recent stuff that I've been working on, it actually ties in with some place names. Now, Native Americans always have place names. Or you go any place in New York State, and I can't pronounce most of the names, right? Because they're Native American place names. Up here, you come up here to Jefferson County, and you know, where do you go? Nowhere. Oswegatchie is over there. There's no native place names. There is some recorded that I've located, okay, which then led me to want to find out where they came from, etc. So we've got a couple of very interesting ones. One of them is recorded in 1670, and it's the name for what I believe I can demonstrate as the Clayton cluster, this group of people that were living right here. Now this name, I'll ruin the pronunciation, is Kahengaeda, means the place they smoked pipes. Now if you're a Native American Haudenosaunee, smoking a pipe was a big deal. That was all about peacemaking, all that kind of stuff. It's almost touching that time period, right? It's like, wow, there's a place name, these people that took this person that recorded it through there, recorded that name. It's like, whoa, okay. Now, and also on the same document, same map, located a name for the Thousand Islands. It's the original Native American name. Now, I'll ruin the pronunciation, but it's Cowan, Awan, Awan. Something like that. Cowan, Ian, I'm not sure. I'm not sure how to pronounce it because nobody's pronounced it in a long time, right? But it's basically the place of many, many islands. So that's the true Native American name for this region. Now, that was very interesting. Now, the other thing is that a site down by Henderson Harbor had a name. An actual village site in Jefferson had a name. It's like, what? That doesn't compute. So the name actually stands for the place that they first thought about the league. All right, not the place where they formed it or anything, but the first where they first thought about it. That name actually, I believe, from my research, came from an Onondaga. So it's basically a traditional Onondaga passed down through. So it's probably pretty darn solid. So you start putting all these pieces together, and you put this final piece pops up in basically a document. It's 1784. It's a treaty at Stanwix, and it first mentions a creek up here. That creek I don't know, Wettering Gunnery, I think is the I don't, but Place of the Fallen Four. It's the name of French Creek. All right. So you start putting all these pieces together. You have a place where they've made peace. Something happened to them guys, but there's a name also, the Place of the Fallen Four. Something went down, and you also all mixed in as another place where they're first thinking about this league. All heck. So there's something going on up here that we're going to get to the bottom to someday. But it's very interesting because we're able to start connecting some of this very, very early history that we have with Jesuits, etc., the French, and the natives up here. We're getting very close to connecting it, right? So that we can say that no, the folks up here did not disappear. They basically, some of them dispersed, but we also think that a population remained. It's just if you're in the middle of a war zone and crazy Europeans, you want to stay hidden. And that's kind of what we believe went on, essentially. So, and that, you know, even the first European through here, Champlain, he might have not been the first one. We have I have an artifact that points to 1613, which lines up with a guy that actually Champlain sent out earlier than he did. So there's a lot of mystery going on too that yet to be discovered. That's for sure. And some of my colleagues have taken some of this from where I have in the early Jesuit period right up through to the Revolutionary War, showing that Native Americans were here. They didn't go away. They were here. They were just a lot wiser and just said, okay, we're not going to be any place where you guys are, because, you know, there's a lot of crazy stuff going on for sure. So that's a big chunk of our heritage up here that I hope that I have connected you to a little bit with. I don't know. But yeah, it's quite a story. That is for sure. And
Ken, what's
yes,
the 4 black items on your screen?
the 4 black items, I'm sorry. That's corn.
Corn.
This is corn. This is a picture of the cob, piece of a cob, and these are just kernels of corn. These we find on Iroquoian sites in there, you know, because they would sometimes roast it, just leave it in the husk and put it around the embers. Who knows, but their fire pits become their garbage disposals. So we archaeologists play in their garbage, right? But this is what you find in there. This is corn. It's like, wow. So that is about 500 years old. I wouldn't recommend eating it, but it's, yeah. So, no, so it's amazing what you can still find in the right conditions, for sure. And so, yeah, no, I just hope I connect you all to a little bit to that deeper past. So when you're out there in the water or wandering around, you can think about that a little bit. That, you know, yeah, people have been wandering this place for a long time. But anyway, thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any questions, you can fire off a few, I guess, here, right? If you want. I got a few minutes.
I have a couple thoughts.
Yeah.
One is you talked about the population of the Native
Yes.
Americans in this area, but right in the beginning you showed the map of the migrating of
Yes.
people, and this is the hub
Yes.
of all that. So, I mean, right at this eastern end of Lake Ontario.
Yes.
So in, I don't know, I connect the dots and say it seems to make sense that they would be here.
Oh, yeah, yeah. No, I mean, it
Because it was a confluence of all those different.
confluence is a good word. Yep, it is. It's a confluence of a bunch of pathways. And essentially, we find people here when it was a glacial lake. And even as that drained down, you still find these same people kind of here. And you can see the influence from all over because they're at this confluence. So it's pretty neat. And you know, we've got some crazy stuff. I didn't mention at one event, the Champlain Sea event, there was a period of time just prior to this low stand where the ocean was down by Ogdensford. The glacier left, the land was squished, here comes the ocean. Lake Champlain was a fjord of the ocean. There's a site over there that's a Native American site that's got tools and stuff and bones from a beluga whale.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and I actually myself down in the trench while I was working in my past life, was down in the ground about 6 feet under a road in Ogdensburg and located a shell midden. Excavator cut right through it. Ocean shell. Yeah. So at one point in time, it would have been let's paddle the canoes down to Ogdensburg for a clam bake. And fresh.
Yeah, wow.
Yeah, and the river would have had tides.
Wow.
Oh,
Yeah.
Sure.
I know you had bones of, you said beavers
Mhm.
and deer. What other kind of animals would these Indians have had?
Pretty much any kind of critter that you can think of would have been on there.
Cows and horses?
No, those are all European. Those are all European. No, all of our domestic livestock we have nowadays is
Came from
imported.
Europe?
Yeah, yep, exactly. So no, it would have been our native species is what you would wanna look to.
Like rabbits?
Rabbits, deer, we did have woodland elk here.
And they would eat that?
Moose, there was a lot of moose.
They would eat that?
Oh, yeah, no,
Okay.
moose was prized.
Okay.
The early Europeans called them cows. If you read the French literature from, the Jesuit relations, they remarked, in fact, in Jesuit relations, they actually talk about almost starving, paddling up the river to come this way. They get, all of a sudden, they get to the Thousand Islands and suddenly there's deer, there's moose, they called them cows, everywhere.
Mhm.
Yeah, they had a free-for-all.
But
Yeah.
they,
So how widespread, I knew Lord Jeffrey Amherst was well known
Yeah.
for spreading smallpox with the blankets.
Yep.
How widely was that trick implemented?
I think it's probably a European trick for a long time, but I don't know. He's just one of the well-known. And of course, the first contact up here was French.
Right.
And because the French are generally thought to want to have, or always said to, it's not always true, wanted to have good relations with the natives versus the other Europeans that didn't so much. But even if it was inadvertent, you're a carrier. Yeah, but I don't know because the first contact was down by Montreal or Quebec, right? And it's hard to say if they were purposely doing that because the first French here needed the native population,
Yeah.
right? So they actually, there's two schools of thought, you either eliminate them or use them, right? And the French were more of a, let's use them for our purposes, they needed it. So I think that at initially at contact it would have, because the French were there for land, but they were there to save souls. They couldn't save you if you're dead. So, right, so no, that was the mission of the Jesuits. That's what, they would all we had Jesuits, the first kind of time that Jesuits came through or here was actually right through French Creek. Right? We went to French Creek and took a walk over and got into up to the Chameau River and down that way. Now, that was like 1655, and some of those guys that were Jesuits, they didn't come back with all their fingers and stuff if they came back. So, not all natives liked Europeans. I can understand.
Good.
But anyway. Well, thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Karen.